he gets the Iron Cross, the flag of the Iron Cross. He chucks it up. He goes around his estate and the neighboring estates, and he goes and literally rallies a group of peasants. So it's like this is trad, right? This is as bad as trad as it gets. Like a lord rallying his peasants, like, we're going to go to war with these people. We're going to go to war with the nationalists to defend the king. And he basically says, to the king of Prussia, like, hey, I've got a peasant army. We're ready to march on Berlin and take these revolutionaries out.
Hey everyone, so we got a great podcast for you today. I am joined by Russell Walter. We've been setting up this collab for a long time now, and super excited to actually hit it. And without further ado, if you could just introduce yourself, Russell. Obviously, a lot of the people on my channel know about yours, and we all enjoy the work, but just a brief introduction into your channel and the mission.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me on. I think this is actually the second podcast appearance that I've done. The first one was way back in the day, and it was for an ammunition company. So yeah, it's good. I'm actually really excited to be on someone else's podcast rather than like being the host. So thanks for inviting me. Yeah, no. So the channel, I started it like so many other people did during COVID, and it's about, I guess, broadly speaking, like Nietzschean themes. I've been sort of obsessed with Nietzsche since I was pretty young. I think I first read an excerpt of Genealogy of Morality when I was either 16 or 17.
Oh, wow.
And since then, I have had, very keen interest in Nietzsche's works and sort of related themes. So I guess that's the main thing. I'm constantly coming back to Nietzsche's work. But otherwise, I talk about, recently I started a podcast and I've been talking a lot about the age of exploration. So historical topics, philosophical topics related to modernity, which I think we're going to get into today.
Yes.
But yeah, generally speaking, I would say that the best way to describe it is looking at perhaps heterodox ideas and looking at sort of Nietzschean themes. That's probably the most succinct summary of the channel.
Yeah, and I think that's I forget if it was one of your Nietzsche videos, one of your BAP videos, or one of your Mishima videos, but those were like the first few that drew me into your channel. And it's interesting seeing the sphere start to sort of form around a lot of these guys. Like traditionally, I would say for at least let's say the past century, I think Nietzsche hasn't really defined the mainstream right, but you almost see a resurgence of his ideas like starting to take more precedence. It's like I don't know if you saw, like, J.D. Vance, the vice president for Trump, follows Ren, which is Rog Nationalist. He follows BAP. He follows like a bunch of other like those kind of guy adjacent people. Like, so it's like you see this sort of zeitgeist shift, which is really interesting. And I guess the topic today that we're going to discuss is essentially, how does an aristocracy adapt itself to this technological modern age and then eventually the future? And I think, like, on your channel, you talk a lot about the distinction between the pastoralists, which are basically the largely like the steppe tribes, which eventually conquer Europe, conquer the Fertile Crescent, conquer the Indus Valley, and establish themselves at the top of the hierarchy. And of course, we can get into the specifics of that. But it's like that's sort of the birth of aristocracy, the birth of the warrior elite. It's these strong, hardy, nomadic peoples. But obviously, we live in a very different age. And even today, it's like, this is something I talk about a lot, right? Like, you've gone from a military elite, which is largely, for the most part, been in charge until maybe like the 1800s, and now you have like a mercantile elite. But in terms of what defines an aristocracy, I think most people can agree, like the modern, whether it's the bureaucratic or mercantile elite, don't reflect an aristocracy. So I guess the question is it possible that the aristocracy has a resurgence? And if it does, how does it do it, retaining that aristocratic spirit while also adapting to an age where, well, you have to have technological ascendancy, technological supremacy. You have to have resources and industry to back yourselves up. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think probably helps to actually define what we mean when we say like aristocracy, because I think you can use the word in a very broad sense to refer to simply rule by the best.
Hmm.
And we're using the word loosely just to refer to rule by the best. And you might define that as the most courageous, the most intelligent, the most entrepreneurial. In that sense, yes, I think like aristocracy definitely can be preserved. Uh, or you can use the word in a more historical sense to refer to a group of people who have actually concretely existed. And whether that can be preserved is probably more questionable. So I think that at the risk of potentially sounding kind of Marxist, I do believe that economics and material conditions do shape politics and even psychology. You know, that's sort of like the. I don't even know if it's a Marxist insight per se, but it is true that the way that we work, the means of production, these things do influence us in very profound ways. Even very intimate ways of thinking are influenced by the sort of work that we do. And I do think that to an extent, aristocracy is a feature of an agricultural economy. If we're talking about it historically, right?
Hmm.
When have aristocracies been ascendant historically? It is in agricultural economies, right? You have like you said, a sort of land owning elite. And when we say land owning, what do we mean? They own an estate, which is worked by peasants who are under them. And like you said, this arrangement came into existence probably, very, very long ago when you had, in Europe, for example, you've got these people who are farming the land, and then you have these pastoralist nomads who come along, conquer Europe, and set themselves up as an elite who live parasitically off the people. So at first, it's almost like very much just standard slavery, isn't it? You come
Right.
in, yeah, you take over territory and you enslave the people and you pretty much treat them like cattle. But over time, I think the system is refined and it loses a bit of its hard edge.
Hmm.
So if you think of a aristocrat in merry old England, right, like in medieval England, he almost has like a sort of paternal relationship with the people on his land. I'm
Yes.
sure some of them do have very bad relationships as well, but generally speaking, he runs the estate. He keeps the people safe. They look up to him because, unlike them, he's educated, and he also protects them in case of an invasion. And they're expected, because they're working his land, to pay a tax. He's effectively their landlord. He's the lord. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally a feature of, I think, an agricultural economy. And I think whether that can survive when you reach modernity is very questionable. But
Hmm.
yeah, like I said, it sort of depends on how you are defining aristocracy. If you're defining aristocracy in a very broad sense, simply to mean quality over quantity, the best should rule, the best should have the majority of the resources. I believe that can persist. But if you're talking about aristocracy as it existed historically, I think it's very questionable. And I think the testimony of history bears that out. The land owning warrior elites have consistently been beaten by mercantile powers. And that's the story of the last 500 years. Is
Hmm.
There's very few exceptions. And I can tell some funny stories. I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I can give some historical examples a little later on. Um, yeah, but I'll give you a chance maybe to speak.
No, for sure. No, that was good, and I think it's an important distinction again between like, well, what defines an aristocracy, and I believe, like you said, right, like the original word is simply ruled by the best, but where we could take that more broad example and say, well, we don't have an aristocracy today, is because, and I mentioned this a lot in my videos. Well, I don't believe that the current system, like liberal democracies, I don't think liberal democracies necessarily actually lead to rule by the best. I think that when you have a system where I'll just make an example really quick. Obviously, when we have these, let's say, warrior elites, right, like the martial aristocracies, there's a very clear exchange of value through warfare. Warfare very easily defines the value of an elite in terms of their competition with another elite. So, well, if this warrior aristocracy grew decadent, they would lose legitimacy because they lose in warfare. So the sons, let's say, of these warriors had to inherit the same skills as their fathers, because if they didn't, well, it would lead to the very quick end of their primacy in society, whether that's being overthrown by another class or being overthrown by an external power. And I think that the reason why there's so much decadence and stagnancy in the quote unquote elites, or let's call them a mercantile economic elite of modernity, as well, there's no real quick shift in terms of who's in power. So if you are the son of like a warrior, obviously, and you are weak and you do not live up to you do not live up close to the level that your father was, well, you'd lose, you'd be conquered. Whereas today, it's like you see this a lot. And I grew up in Silicon Valley, which is relatively wealthy, right? You have a lot of tech guys, you have a lot of wealthy people, and you see this a lot. Is these kids, they'll pretty much piss their way through high school, get average grades at best, but then they can afford to go to a pretty good college because, well, they have the money to do so. They can afford good tutors, this and that, and largely they're going to inherit a lot of the influence that their parents had. And of course, this gets exacerbated the higher up you go. You see many of the sort of really, really wealthy families, especially in the United States, is regardless of how skilled you are as an entrepreneur, even if you suck, you just have your board of directors do it for you. Whereas I think that in the past, there was a very real elemental relationship with power, in the sense that, well, you had to be great, you had to be exceptional. So the reason why I would say that the modern elite are not an aristocracy is because this system does not accurately reflect value. I mean, all of modernity and all of the elite of modernity are all manipulating things that represent value, rather than actually exercising a actions that will determine whether their value is greater or not. And what I mean by that, maybe that sounds a little bit wordy, but essentially it's like warfare. It all comes down to warfare. And I think that today, because we live, at least in the West and in the developed world, in relatively peaceful times, it's like, well, how do you determine value today? And I think largely you're going to see our mistakes catch up to us. And I think I can sort of bring Spangler into this in a bit. It's like, well, we are very close to potentially being in conflict again. We've had, 80 years, let's say, of like relative peace. I mean, since World War II, it's been relatively peaceful with little conflicts here and there. So we have this detachment from understanding what constitutes value on a more real level, like I said, which is warfare. So it's like, well, China very much understands the necessity for projecting power, for building their instruments of power. And there's a lot of good books on this. One of them is 100-Year Marathon, which talks about this long game that the Chinese have been planning, literally since Mao, to become the worldwide hegemon. So all this to say, and I kind of went on a bit as well, but what I'm trying to say is that without a real arena for determining value, which is warfare, we lose sight of what defines an aristocracy. Ultimately, an aristocracy is, if it's ruled by the best, it's ruled by the best. And how is that proven most accurately? It's proven through warfare. And without this sort of conflict, we do not truly have a relationship with value that reflects whether this elite is actually worthy of being an elite or not. And I'll just finish that point there. But like I guess that's what I'm trying to say is like without a relationship with warfare, right, and without understanding that ultimately everything leads to war, in one regard or another. That's to me what I guess like to me an aristocracy has to essentially be a military elite.
Mm. Yeah, so you could think about it like a mechanism by which like there can be elite turnover basically. Like historically speaking, that's the case. That how do elites fall and how are they replaced? Well, it's primarily through warfare. So if you have a long peace, it's almost like a forest, like it's like the dead wood is being um the dead wood is being like built up or something. I don't know. There's no mechanism in place to replace the elite. Is that sort of what you're saying without military competition?
Yeah, exactly. It like draws it out, you know, way longer than it would naturally.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yeah. Yeah, I think that it is the ultimate test really of a state is whether they can survive militarily, because what is the state in essence? It's really a monopoly over violence, right?
Hmm.
Can you monopolize violence within a territory? That's basically what sovereignty is. And if you can't do that, then you're no longer sovereign. Of course, the thing is, these mercantile elites actually are quite good, I would say, at monopolizing violence. They do remain. They do remain. I truly do believe they. Whether they'll be competent militarily in the future, I don't know. And there's been a couple of things that already suggest that maybe the American military is not what it once was. But yeah, it's definitely a good point that war conflict in some ways is the ultimate test of the state.
Yeah, and I think because of that, right? I think we could sort of tie this into one of the things you talked about in your last video was distinguishing these larger polities, like I guess that's sort of alluding to, for example, maybe an empire or or just a larger country in general versus like the smaller, let's say a city state, for instance. And I think it's interesting because something that Spangler talks about in Man and Technics is that during the, I believe it's like the 1800s, is that the aristocracy starts to develop in a way where they regard things like warfare as barbaric. They believe like economics and engineering are not worthy pursuits. They sort of start to collectively make like the creation of cultural projects and the arts their main objective. And Spangler points to this as a potential like weak point in Western civilization going forward because it's like, you know, obviously that which makes life rich, that which contributes to higher culture is prioritizing these things. It's prioritizing something almost resembling metaphysical instead of like just this very materialistic view of things. So he says that, well, because the aristocracy became too focused on cultural projects and the arts, it gave rise to liberalism and Marxism, which are, you know, obviously very materialistic, because they ignored things like economics and engineering. And then it's largely liberalism and Marxism try to see a material solution for all these things as the way to go forward. And in doing so, going over time, he points to the fact that what allowed the West to retain its primacy over the rest of the world was the fact that, well, the West has had that technical secret of understanding how to create industry. And by having more industry than the rest of the world, it allowed them to project their power. And he says one of the biggest mistakes of the West was sharing the secret with the East, for example. And, you know, I point this out because it's like, in the current geopolitical situation, you do see a country like China, which has a very very large industrial base, and obviously a lot of that has come as a result of the United States essentially closing down a lot of our domestic production and outsourcing it to China. And it's not to say I'm not blackpilling on the United States, because one of the biggest disadvantages a country like China has is they have to import like a big majority of their energy to sustain this industrial project. They also don't have a lot of arable land, so they have a lot of issues that are coming up in the future. But in terms of what a aristocracy needs to sustain itself in the future, uh, Spangler is pointing to the fact that it must understand that, like, the power of the state ultimately relies on not necessarily prioritizing on top of everything else, but at least making it a priority, making economics a priority, engineering, warfare, because it's like without you can have like the most rich and vibrant culture, right? But obviously, if the state can't defend itself and the state can't ensure that its power is sufficient to protect its sovereignty, then all that falls out the window, right? So I guess one of the things I want to talk about today as well is like, how do you balance the smaller scale civilization that has all these very rich cultural works, which are very beautiful and which make life better, right? It increases the quality of life while also understanding, well, power projection is what allows us the idle time, right, to pursue these projects. And I guess my question for you is, how do you see the ideal state going forward? And do you think, like, how do you balance retaining a rich culture while also being like, well, realistically, we also have to focus on the state's power?
Yeah, so in that video that you cited a second ago, like I quote Nietzsche, this essay, What the Germans Lack. And he says, culture and the state, one should not deceive oneself about this, are antagonists. One lives off the other, one thrives at the expense of the other. So that's sort of, in a way, what you just said, because it's clear that if all of your energy is going into cultural production, then you will neglect these more practical sort of realpolitik matters, right?
Yes.
And that's why he says that ultimately cultural flourishing occurs in a state of decay, basically. So you could think about the Athenian Golden Age, or the Athenian Golden Age under Pericles. Well, that occurs just before the fall, doesn't it? Because you could say the energy of the citizens starts to be directed in towards these matters rather than matters of state, and that makes them vulnerable to outside attack. And yeah, with very quickly after the Golden Age, Athens falls and is conquered. And you could say something similar about Renaissance Florence. So it's quite clear that I agree with that statement, right? That culture and the state are in some ways antagonists. If you want a strong state, then naturally, like you're going to have to put most of your energy into that. You're going to have to put most of your energy in towards military matters, things like self-expression, and all of these things will come second to uniformity, unity. And it's pretty clear that the small state, like I personally, you asked me like what my ideal state would be. I mean, I personally prefer the small state. I'd rather live in a small state. I'm a very much a federalist. I like decentralization, and I'm against bigness, almost full stop, whether it be like corporate or governmental, which is obviously a bit of a libertarian point, but nevertheless, I adhere to that. I do believe that. I am a federalist, but I recognize that ultimately the age that we're living in is not conducive to that. It's not realistic. It's almost the same as saying, I don't like technology. And I think that we would have happier lives if we were perhaps less technologically advanced. I think there might be some truth to that, but it's a sort of null point because it's not practical. Like, the practical reality is that anyone who wants to survive in the 21st century will have to live in a large unified state and we'll also have to be technologically advanced.
Right.
So, I like, yeah. So I think with politics, is always, is an ought. The way things ought to be, in my opinion, is we should live in something like a city state or a principality. I think small scale living, and when I say that, I'm not small. I'm still cosmopolitan. Like I do like. I don't like sort of parochial narrow-mindedness that you often find with people who make these arguments. I like big picture thinking and civilizational thinking, but I do think these these small states are more conducive to human flourishing,
Hmm.
because I think it's just more in line with our psychology, right? We're not adapted to live like this. It's not natural for man to be thinking um, big picture all the time. It's not natural to, in order to get a grasp of a situation, to have to rely on statistics and data. I think ideally you should, ideally you would be in like a city state with 100,000 people at tops. I genuinely think that that is the system of government that is most suited to humans. But like you said, that's probably not practical in a world of empires.
Yeah, especially I think looking at how I think it does, like, obviously the size of societies is going to scale alongside technological advancement because everything is just exacerbated. The more you have these tools essentially, which allow you to take up more space, allow you to sustain larger populations, right? So it's like, in a sense, it's inevitable. And I very much resonate with what you said about like smaller scale living. I think that there's a lot of beauty in the past that is turned gray in modernity. I think like warfare, for example. There's a lot of beauty in the artistry of past warfare, which in which like the aristocracy were very, very much different than the peasant soldier, right? Like that was their life. Their life was warfare. Their life was dedicating themselves to that craft. But it's like today, it's the skill necessary to wage war is such that you don't need to spend 10 or 20 years learning how to shoot a longbow, or you don't need to spend 10 to 20 years learning how to ride a horse and learning how to use a sword. It's like very easy to train up. Like a Navy SEAL even is his that's probably one of the longest pipelines, but it's like 2 or 3 years, right, to train up a Navy
Mm.
SEAL. Um, so I agree with you. It's like as time goes on, it's like a lot of the beauty that you see in the past is replaced with this mechanization. It's replaced with more large scale societies where people are more similar and there's a lot less distinction between different people. It's like even in Greece, right? Like when you had a collection of city states, or Italy, or where I mean Italy's actually a very good example because you see the ramifications of it more recently. During World War II, the Italians, one of the reasons they performed so poorly is because everybody spoke different dialects. It's like,
Oh.
how are you supposed to sustain a war effort where you're giving out orders and this guy's like, oh, I don't understand what you're saying, and that's because of the sort of decentralized collection of different city states in Italy and the distinct cultures that each of them had, and it's very beautiful. But it's like I said, as time goes on, and you have more mechanized societies, you have larger societies, it becomes necessary to also expand the state. And I know you're a big fan of Dune as well, or at least I assume so because you've done some videos on Dune. But
Mm.
like what I think is interesting about Dune is that it's almost a it's almost like a futurist society that retains the past way of life because it's like these guys are fighting with swords and stuff, basically. I mean, knives, right? It's essentially a feudal society, with a lance rod, and then you have the Padishah emperor in the middle. But I guess going forward, right? I think that it becomes like we have a like, you know, we want to still retain that beauty. I think something Bap talks about with China is like these people have always pretty much lived in these huge cities, and almost like to the point where it's like, well, this is a very dreary life. You know, it's like there's these huge cities, people live so close together. You know, they're completely communalized, and I think that at a certain point, right, like you can say, hey, we have to maximize the state for power because, like, well, we have to exist. But it's like at a certain point, I think even doing that becomes detrimental. And I think you see this in China today. It's like there's very little difference between these different people because it's like they have a very unified culture. They have a very unified upbringing. And it leads to like essentially a cloning of one human type.
Mm.
And I think that, you know, we can agree that that's not ideal. And it's like there's got to be some balance, I think. And I think that that's attainable. That there's some balance between saying, okay, well, the state requires prioritization to project power, to be strong, while also retaining that individualism. And I think that I like to always point to Rome because I think Rome did a great job of creating an individual identity within a collective identity. Because the thing with Rome is they didn't really function like a lot of the other states with an aristocratic military elite because of the sort of meritocratic element within Rome. It's like you had plenty of plebeians that end up becoming emperors eventually, or end up becoming very powerful or very influential generals. It's like, but like the overall instrument of the state is warfare in Rome. And I think you also mentioned Rome in your last video and how, like, compared to Greece, they have less cultural projects and it's more of a copy of Greece. However, I think when you try to say, okay, well, how do we balance the state maximizing its power while also retaining a rich culture? I think Rome does a very good job at this. And I think it's largely because of the imperial identity. When they expand, they also they can't just retain a very small, specific aristocracy, right? Because obviously, if it was just the patrician class holding land whenever they conquered new territories, that just wouldn't be sustainable. And it's like this. It's like they very much have an individual identity. The individual Roman general or legate, he wants to distinguish himself through feats in warfare. He also wants to be a complete man. You know, obviously, there still were a lot of cultural projects in Rome, but it was all within the collective identity of glorifying Rome, of making Rome greater. And I think, to me, they did a very good job of having individualism within the collective identity. The collective identity of, okay, well, Rome has to be powerful. We need to contribute to the power of Rome, while also not being this carbon copy clone of a person that you see in countries like China. You know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah, I think, well, going back to what you were saying originally, I actually feel like looking at historical examples can help concretize what we're saying and make it a little less abstract. So you take the example of both Japan and then Germany. They're the two examples I have in mind. So obviously Japan, right, in the Edo period is like the sort of aristocratic regime par excellence, right? You have a hereditary warrior class who, like you said, have to spend years on end training, and you're born into it, right? You're born into being a samurai, and you play an essential role in the state. You essentially, you have a lot of political resources for political control. That could not survive, right? And also another thing to mention, right, is their attitude towards merchants. So I believe that, like, you can conceptualize like Japanese feudalism like a triangle where you have, the emperor or whatever at the top. And again, sorry, I don't know much about Japan. I'm just using this as a point,
For sure.
right? And at the bottom you have the peasants, but underneath even the peasants you have the merchants, right?
Yes.
That was their attitude towards merchants, is that they're lower than peasants because they don't produce anything. All they do is buy abroad for cheap and sell here for, high. So they buy low, sell high, and that's quite contemptible. It comes across as exploitative, and that's why they put the merchant below the peasant. Well, when Commodore Perry came, representing a very, very mercantile nation, the United States of America, it became very apparent to them that they had to change everything, right? Because a hereditary samurai class was not going to stand up to America. So I think they quickly afterwards, right after that contact with Commodore Perry, they abolished the temple schools and they bring about standardized education run by the state. They urbanize. They start to, as you said, they have these peasant armies, right? These peasant armies. They start to recruit peasants, and arm them. And they do all of this because they recognize that this is absolutely necessary if they want to survive. That if they don't want to be colonized, they're going to have to adopt a lot of these things that they have contempt for. So they're going to have to be mercantile, because the old way of doing things, where you have a hereditary land owning warrior elite in an agrarian economy, that will not be able to survive. And the other example that I wanted to cite was the unification of Germany, where I've been reading Bismarck's memoirs, and he is obviously a Prussian Junker, right? Like a Prussian aristocrat who was also a farmer. He had an estate. He had peasants on that estate who grew crops, and he was a lot of their income is essentially in the form of raw materials like crops. You know what I mean? Rather than a fiat currency or whatever. Now, he went to university, and I think originally he had some sympathies towards nationalism, but then he came into contact with a German fraternity movement, which was a nationalist movement. At this time, Germany is obviously not unified.
Right.
He's in Prussia, and he's going to university, I believe, in Berlin, and he comes into contact with these nationalists. Now, nationalism in its inception was a left-wing force, right? The idea of the people is sort of inherently kind of left-wing, right?
Yes.
Which it's also nationalist, but the idea that the people, the German people, should make the political decisions. They should have the bulk of the political power. That idea is very alien to monarchy or aristocracy, which says, there is a people, but these people are subjects, right? And they do not have political power. We do, right? We make the political decisions, et cetera, et cetera. Now, anyway, he comes into contact with these nationalists who want to abolish the monarchy, or if not abolish it, radically reform it. And he wants to, and they want a national culture, one language. So that represents a sort of homogenization, doesn't it? Which we've been talking about. A homogenization of culture. They actually would burn symbols that were that were symbolic of, a particular German principality or kingdom. So, sort of like a typical student in the 1960s, right? Where they'd go and they'd grab, or maybe even a student today who burns an American flag. It's like back then, the student movement was burning flags associated with the Prussian monarchy or the Saxon monarchy, and the students are rallying around the German flag. And anyway, he considers them plebeian, right? He considers them totally plebeian. And through his contact with the student movement, he becomes a sort of arch conservative or a total reactionary. And he says, like, nationalism is inherently plebeian, totally against it. Now, in 1848, these nationalist revolutions spread throughout the European continent. And on his estate, these rebels or revolutionaries, they come. And I believe that on his estate, he would have been flying flags associated, I guess, with his own family. And also perhaps associated with the monarchy as well, I'm not sure. And the revolutionaries come along and they say, you need to basically take down those flags and hoist up a German flag, otherwise we'll come back with armed men, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and he basically goes, like, this is, I kind of love this, because if you're a sort of romantic conservative or a reactionary, right, how cool is this? he gets the Iron Cross, the flag of the Iron Cross. He chucks it up. He goes around his estate and the neighboring estates, and he goes and literally rallies a group of peasants. So it's like this is trad, right? This is as bad as trad as it gets. Like a lord rallying his peasants, like, we're going to go to war with these people. We're going to go to war with the nationalists to defend the king. And he basically says, to the king of Prussia, like, hey, I've got a peasant army. We're ready to march on Berlin and take these revolutionaries out. And they say, look, we appreciate that, but I don't think we want like some like peasants with almost zero training, like running into Berlin. But anyway, this is quite a long-winded story. But I do feel like what happens is he essentially, ascends to the leader of the country. I can't remember if
it's chancellor, right?
Chancellor, yeah. But then of course it's confusing, right? Because he's the leader under different forms of government. So he leads. There's all these constitutional reforms that occur in Prussia after the 1848 revolution. Then he establishes, the North German Confederation, and then eventually he becomes the chancellor. I don't know. I think at different stages there's different titles. You know what I mean? He's assuming different titles under these various different forms of governance. But that's sort of minutiae. It doesn't really matter. The main point is that he quickly realizes, this reactionary, this sort of quintessential reactionary, he realizes that he has no hope of preserving that old order. He is like an agrarian romantic. He says things like the deracinated urbanites. He says things exactly like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Deracinated urbanites, the industrialists, all they care about is money. They're going to, like the weakness, like, these people have no culture. They're like all of the things that you would kind of hear from a reactionary on Twitter in a way.
Yeah.
The sort of typical talking points. But then he has this quote, and I'm going to butcher it because I'm paraphrasing it, but he says, something like, you cannot, the statesman cannot determine the tide of history. All he can do is ride it, right? He can't like, in a way, his initial stance when he literally was raised an army and was ready to fight against the nationalists who were supported by industrialists in the city, right? The nationalists were supported by industrialists who, of course, an industrialist wants a nation because he wants a unified currency. He wants to be able to do trade seamlessly, easily over large stretches of territory, right? So, of course, they embrace nationalism. In these small little principalities, you have to pay, tariffs, customs. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it makes trading difficult. So they all back him up. And originally he's this sort of agrarian reactionary against the urbanites in the city who support nationalism, and he supports monarchy. But he realizes that the tide of history is inevitably going in that direction, right?
Yeah.
And that you can't completely stem it. All you can do is steer as best you can. And he ends up becoming a nationalist. He is the man who unified Germany, the man who saw nationalism as a plebeian force. But he did it in such a way that the Prussian aristocracy, of which he was a part, was at the head of that nation. So I think ultimately, I guess, I understand that's very, very long-winded, those two examples, but I do think it kind of helps concretize what we're talking about, is almost inevitably in that age, like if Germany had just remained like these little principalities that were agrarian rather than industrial, and they were led by aristocrats in the traditional historical sense, then Germany would have just been subject to constant invasion. Like Napoleon walked all over those, like the Holy Roman Empire. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He could just walk into these kingdoms and principalities, take them over with ease.
Italy
None
too,
of them
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So pretty much it became apparent after Napoleon had brought about, the first national army and the first real, nation. Sorry, I shouldn't say the French Revolution brought about that, but it became apparent that like we can't really compete with this idea. We can't compete with this unified nation
Mm-hmm.
as like a small principality. We need to unify. It's sort of inevitable. And I guess like my fear is that something similar is perhaps happening now, where the nations themselves become the equivalent of the German principality or the Italian principality. They're they're actually increasingly unable to compete with you in some ways that they need to be unified, right? And perhaps that's what's happening is like it's just inching towards greater and greater state expansion just in order to defend itself against, other things. But I think inevitably with that comes homogenization and some cultural sterility. I do think it's an almost inevitable feature.